Well, continuing our series about the temple, this is a continuous story, 5,000 years long, from Abraham when God summoned him to Mount Moriah to the end of the kingdom, the end of the millennial temple. And it's a little hard to cover it in this way, but we'll pick it up from where we were last week. Last week we saw Abraham at Mount Moriah in a dramatic vignette we once made over there. And we talked about the tabernacle. We had Dr. Tom McCall on for some teaching with a model, and we traced the route of the children of Israel in the Exodus. They came out of Egypt and went down to Mount Sinai, and here at Sinai God instructed them to build the tabernacle. Then they carried the thing with them 40 years. They carried it to Eilat and Kadesh Barnea and back to Eilat and through Edom and Moab and Mount Nebo, finally into Jericho, and they put the tabernacle at Shiloh, which is a little city north of Jerusalem. Now, on this program, we're going to have the archaeologist Ian Stern, and we shot this on location in Israel at the city of David. Understand, when the children of Israel entered the Promised Land, there really was no Jerusalem, but they, in the area of Mount Moriah, settled a little hill called the City of David, and it was the original Jerusalem. The Ophel is a little hill that comes down from the temple site on the southern side, and God had a temple site in mind, of course, Mount Moriah, where Abraham had been told to offer Isaac in sacrifice. So we're 500 years later when they enter the land and put the tabernacle at Shiloh. God said this in Deuteronomy 12:11, "Then there shall be a place which the Lord your God shall choose to cause his name to dwell there. Thither shall you bring all that I command you, your burnt offerings and sacrifices, your tithes and the heave offering of your hand, and all your choice vows which you vow unto the Lord. And you'll rejoice before the Lord God, ye and your sons and daughters," and so on. He says, "Take heed to thyself that thou offer not thy burnt offerings in every place that thou seest, but in the place which the Lord shall choose, in one of thy tribes. There thou shalt offer the burnt offerings, and there thou shalt do all that I command thee." So worship continued at Shiloh, but in everybody's mind was the idea there would be a temple someday in a permanent location. And they continued to worship under the judges for more than 4 centuries. A nation was formed and defended. It was an Israel like today, with enemies everywhere, inside the land, outside the land. Being the chosen people then was no easier than being the chosen people now. But the people still worshiped and sacrificed and thought about making a house of God that would be permanent. Now, they had no particular leader to do that. The judges, really, if you read the biblical history, were pretty busy just keeping the land together, keeping it consolidated. They were attacked all the time on every border and from within. But as the kingdom grew in strength and as it won some battles and as God allowed it, the idea of the temple took form. And finally, a very brilliant and talented youngster was born to the tribe of Judah. We made a dramatic kind of a video presentation of David as a youth, and I'd like to go to that now.
The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
Well, David grew to manhood and became one of the most famous people in all history. A poet, a musician, a soldier, a sinner, and king of the Jews for 40 years. You know, his biography is so real. The Old Testament tells these human stories where you can see the human condition. You live with him through his sins and his repentance and his prayers, and you know, most of the Psalms were his, and it's really some of history's most majestic writings. Believers and unbelievers alike agree. And he was an able king. He was a great captain and a wonderful king. Israel was never as strong in all history as it was 3,000 years ago under King David and his son Solomon. And you have to wonder, will the son of David come now? Messiah is called the son of David. Matthew 1:1 says, HaSefer Yeshua HaMashiach ben David ben Avraham, the book of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. David really had a heart for God. He prayed, he sang songs to God, he confessed, he was mindful always of God's promise of a permanent temple. The tabernacle, of course, stood at Shiloh, and David wanted to build a permanent house. But the city of David, which he settled, the area that he captured to begin with, was really too small to build a proper temple of God. He always eyed Mount Moriah. Looking north from where he was, he could see that splendid mountain plateau. I have a bird's eye view of the situation in Jerusalem. This is the whole area, with Mount Scopus up here, Mount of Olives here, and Mount Zion here. And here is the little city of David, relatively small hillside here below Mount Moriah. And here is the platform, the summit of Mount Moriah, where the temple would eventually stand. David lived down here. He watched this area. It was empty, and it was very good for a temple. We can see the city of David in an artist's conception here. Here's the wall of that little hill where the city was, and here to the north you can see the plateau, and you could see where David surmised it would be a wonderful place to put a temple, and indeed it was a wonderful place. The city of David has been excavated over the last few years. It's the oldest find in Jerusalem. It goes back fully the 3,000 years. The archaeologists have found wonderful things, whole houses and artifacts left there by people from, of course, the times of the kings. Our tours go through it when we go there, and we use the archaeologist Ian Stern, an expert on the temple and the city of David. And on the last trip, we asked him to teach us some. We brought the video camera and asked him to teach us about that fascinating time and place in the city of David.
One of the questions that we usually ask ourselves is, first of all, why the city of David here? Why would David make this his capital? And those answers we could, let's say, address in a couple of ways. First of all, just by looking at the area that we're standing in, we realize that we're on a small hill. In other words, this is defensible. We have valleys on either side. Secondly, this area has a water source, the Gihon spring, that still gushes forth, as the word Gihon implies. So water and defensibility make this an ideal spot for a town. But it is not. We're not yet speaking of a spiritually important center yet. This is a small little backwater town that has its raison d'etre. Now what will happen is, for the first 7.5 years after David is king, he is going to be ruling in his own tribal area of Judah in a town called Hebron. But there's a problem with that. And the problem is that the other tribes are jealous. Why should the capital be in David's area? Why not in one of the areas of one of the other tribes? Similar to the American problem about 200 years ago, where the original capital was in Philadelphia, and the other colonies or states were saying, well, why should it be there? Why not in one of the other states? And eventually they find a neutral area, centrally located, Washington, D.C. Well, David sees the problem and finds a similar solution, but it was a few thousand years earlier. Here he sees this little town that Joshua had not conquered, Jebus, and he says to the generals that he has, the first to conquer the city will be my chief of staff the rest of his life. That's paraphrasing, of course, 2 Samuel. Now what's going to happen is one of his generals, Yoav in Hebrew, will take a commando unit and go through the Tzinor, through the water tunnel, and they will conquer it, and now it will become the city of David, Zion, Jerusalem. It'll become his capital, and David will bring the Ark of the Covenant in here. Now, once we get into this little area, we're standing specifically right now into an area called Area G. There are many other areas of the city of David that one could, let's say, focus on, but this is probably the most important area. Why? Because in this specific area, we can see 3 subsections of the First Temple period very clearly. In other words, right behind me over here, we have a slope, what's referred to as the stepped stone structure. Now, above that slope is probably the highest point in the city of David, which means, by extension, that was probably where David had his palace. Now, if we look at 2 Samuel, we get a very nice idea of what was going on. The king always has his palace in the higher portion of the city. And when we read 2 Samuel, we know at one point he is standing on the balcony of his palace one evening. It's a balmy evening. He looks out below him, and he notices in one of the homes below, on one of the rooftops, a woman by the name of Bathsheba, sunbathing or whatever. His heart goes out to the woman, and he invites her to his palace. Before you know it, she is with child. Unfortunately, as we read further, we know that she is also with husband, a man named Uriah. Okay, now this is somewhat problematic, and it'll be addressed later on. In other words, what's going to happen to David as a result of this? This is maybe the major issue here. As we look at David and we say, how can one reconcile this segment in 2 Samuel with the, let's say, traditional view of David? And we have to first of all realize that David is not a perfect human being. He is a person which has his faults, his weaknesses, and his strengths. Secondly, when we look at David, we realize that he doesn't get away with it. He has to beg the people for forgiveness. He begs the prophet Nathan for forgiveness, which is an amazing thing for a king to do today, no less 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. And finally, of course, he pays for the mistake. Okay, that is to say, the child will die, and he is not allowed to build a temple. In other words, what's the message here? The king is not above the law. Okay, he is part of that covenant, and we see that message throughout the Bible. Now, that is how I would refer to at least the earlier, or the earliest portion over here, the stepped stone structure. The palace being up above there. Later on, we look at the middle section, so to speak, of the First Temple period. That was around 720, after the northern kingdom of Israel. The 10 tribes in the north are conquered by Assyria, and the refugees flow into the city of Jerusalem. And what will happen at that point is the city expands. People are searching for places to live, and one of the areas that they're going to settle in, certainly the wealthy will try and do that, is in this area right over here. They are going to come to the stepped stone structure and dig into it, so to speak, setting up in a terraced type of fashion homes, and the home right behind me, or the house of Achiel, being a typical Israelite house, one of the homes of those refugees who flee into Jerusalem, find refuge here, and will remain here. And finally, what I think is probably the most dramatic of the finds in Area G over here, and that is the stuff that was found in a room called the Room of the Bulai. Bulai being these small little clay seals. There were 50 of them that were found. 31 different names appear there. But one of those names starts to make history. A name that people really didn't refer to. Most people visiting Israel never heard of before, perhaps. But when it appears in this treasury, so to speak, it becomes eminently important. The name Gemaryahu ben Shaphan. Gemaryahu, the son of Shaphan, appears in one of those seals. And one would say at a certain point, well, who cares? But when one looks at the book of Jeremiah, one understands why it's so important. Jeremiah, of course, is the prophet that's around in the time of the destruction. In other words, the Babylonians are outside the city of Jerusalem. They are surrounding the city. We're under siege. And what's going to happen is Jeremiah is telling the people, give in, forget it. You've broken the covenant, and now you're going to pay the price. You're going to be defeated by the Babylonians because you have not maintained the covenant. Now, Jeremiah speaks to his assistant Baruch. And then Baruch will take the scroll, the message, to the king. But he doesn't go directly to the king. Baruch goes to the scribe of the king. Who is that scribe? Gemaryahu ben Shaphan. Now, it makes sense to find 50 seals not in an average person's home, but rather 50 bulai are found in the home of a scribe. When we look at where that home exists, it exists right over here in Area G, not far from the residence of the king, and hence again, it makes sense. The official scribe of the king should live relatively close to the monarch at that time, and again, the proximity makes sense. It's logical. It fits into a pattern. And of course, finally, the beauty of it all. Not always in archaeology do we find, let's say, biblical text and archaeological finds kind of blending together. but here it fits beautifully together. Here we have the text from Jeremiah fitting beautifully into, let's say, this which we find in Area G. In other words, archaeological finds and biblical text flowing together to fill in gaps that we had in our history of this site. Now we've come to the other side of Area G. And here I'd like to explain to you a little bit about the controversy. This is probably the most controversial excavation that's taken place in all of Israel's history. And the reason for that is because certain elements in Israel's society believe that at one time, in the Middle Ages, there was a cemetery here. Now, in order to understand this controversy, we have to take a couple of steps back. First of all, we have to understand what an archaeological tell is. Now, a tell is an artificial plateau of civilization levels. Or to put it differently, let's imagine that we together here are building a city. And we build our homes, and we build a sidewalk, and we live here for a while. And then an outsider comes, destroys our homes, the whole area is rubble, and another civilization comes to live in that same area. For whatever reasons, there's water there, it's defensible, and they build their homes, but they don't have a bulldozer. They can't just push everything out of the way. So what they'll do is they'll add rubble to the rubble that's already there, smooth it out, and build their sidewalk on this level. Now what will happen is then they'll build their homes, they'll live there for a while, and they'll be conquered. There'll be more rubble, and then eventually that process will continue 10, 15, 20, 30 times, and then you have this layer cake of history that we call a tell. Now once we understand that, we can address the whole problem of this excavation. There are certain elements in Israeli society, the ultra-Orthodox, who believe that there was a cemetery here in the Middle Ages. Now, from there, we have to shoot over to what took place here in the actual area. In other words, the first excavations that take place here are in the late 1920s. A man named McAllister is excavating here, and he discovers a tower over here, number 3. And he identifies that as the Tower of David. Now, he's wrong, but he never realizes that. Now, he dies, and from his perspective, that's the Tower of David, and he makes no mention, okay, of hitting any cemetery. What he actually hit was something from the time of, let's say, the Hellenistic period. But the important point to realize here is that he went from 20th century level all the way down through all the layers, including the Middle Ages, until he hit that tower, no cemetery discovered, and again, he had no reason to hide a cemetery. If he saw a cemetery, he would have registered the finds in his log, in his report, or let's say we have to assume that he missed it completely. In either case, no cemetery is there. The next time this area is excavated is in the 60s, in 1960s, when Kathleen Kenyon excavates here, and she discovers more remains going back to, let's say, the Israelite period. And during that excavation, she also is digging down and has no evidence of a cemetery, no less a medieval cemetery. Then we hit the 70s, and the late Dr. Shiloh from Hebrew University is excavating here, and he is excavating, and all of a sudden, there are demonstrations and rocks being thrown, etc. Why? Again, they claim is that there was a cemetery here. But if there was a medieval cemetery, remembering the layer cake idea, that cemetery would have been removed by the first 2 excavators, either McAllister or Kenyon. So why the controversy? Again, there was a seeming, let's say, mutual exclusivity, at least on the part of the people who were demonstrating, who felt that modernity, science, archaeology cannot coexist with religion. And hence they demonstrated against it in a way that made it hit the press all around the world. Now, eventually, due to these different pressures and forces, what will happen is the excavation stops for a while, and this whole issue goes to the courts, and eventually they will give Shiloh permission to continue. But he will actually make a compromise with the ultra-Orthodox elements, and he'll only excavate up to the edges of what we see here in this archaeological garden in front of you, Area G. He reaches that compromise with them, and maybe it's a little bit sad, because maybe he could have excavated a little bit more. But for me, the importance, maybe the beauty of this whole dilemma, this whole, controversy, is that Here we're in the Jewish state 2,000 years after not having had a state, 3,000 years after David. And what's being debated in our parliament, in our Knesset, what's going on all the talk shows in Israel, was this whole issue of something that took place in our ancient past. David, was the city here? What happened here? Okay, and that makes it very special. Again, there's something amazing about coming to Israel today, and in the 1980s we're discussing something that took place thousands of years ago, and it's relevant to us. Now, aside from the things I've mentioned, there are lots of other things that allow us to relate to the site, not as a pile of rocks, but rather as a site of humanity, of people. Okay, and if we wanted to, we realize that we have a toilet here, almost a flush toilet that goes back 3,000 years. Now again, why am I pointing this out? Not to be flippant, but to show you that we're not dealing with something mythological, something abstract, but rather real human beings. Okay, and aside from the toilets, we have burnt remains from the destructions that took place here. We have staircases, homes, rooms. In other words, again, one has to realize that we're not talking in the abstract, we're not just talking about stones, we are talking about people like you and I.
Well, Ian is such an interesting teacher. We're going to have him back in several shows coming up. You know, we don't have this problem in the United States. There's no cemetery controversy here that we'd be digging in the ground and discover some ancient layer where we buried people, because the United States has got one layer, no conquerors. This is the difference of you know, when we look back at the city of David, we're looking back 3,000 years. Our nation is about 200 years old, and that just hasn't happened. So it's something that only happens in a place like that. You know, the houses that they found there in the city of David, all of those artifacts date from 1,600 years before Mohammed came. So that if in the controversy of the West Bank and Israel, it is very clear by the buildings on the land, at least if you go back historically, who was there to begin with. The village of Silwan in the West Bank, which is rather troubled, can see the ancient ruins of the city of David from where they live. And it is clear that people were there before the advent of Islam, if that's an argument. But from David's palace, he could see Mount Moriah, and that's a very important point. Here again, the city of David, David could look upwards this way, see that beautiful plateau, and dream of building the house of God up there. And of course, the significance was he well knew the story of Abraham and Isaac. That is exactly the plateau where God told Abraham to bring Isaac in the land of Moriah to one of the mountains I will tell thee of, Genesis 22:2. And there he brought Isaac, and so it seemed like a very appropriate place for everyone to offer their sacrifices. Well, one day he was talking to Nathan the prophet. I'm reading from 2 Samuel 7:1-3. And it came to pass, when the king sat in his house, and the Lord had given him rest round about from all his enemies, that the king said unto Nathan the prophet, See now, I dwell in an house of cedar, but the ark of God dwelleth within curtains. In other words, David had a splendid palace made of cedar woods from Lebanon and so forth, and dwelt very nicely, but Almighty God lived in the tabernacle tent that we've talked about. It was carried through the wilderness and put at Shiloh, north of Jerusalem. And David was, as his life went on, wanting to write this thing and give God a permanent house. And Nathan said to the king, verse 3, Go, do all that is in thine heart, for the Lord is with thee. God rewarded David's feelings and his initiative toward this project with the Davidic Covenant, a wonderful promise of eternal dynasty. God said David's heirs would rule forever in Israel. And this has been fulfilled in Jesus, the son of David, and of course in his kingdom to come. Jesus' parents, Mary and Joseph, of course, both descend from David through Nathan and through Solomon. But it turns out David really could not be the temple builder. The thing wrong with David was there was just too much blood on his hands, and the scripture says that. From the day that he was the champion of Israel and fought Goliath, and through his times as a captain in Israel's armies and so on, he had to be killer of men. And the people were saying Saul has killed thousands, but David has killed 10,000. Well, the temple was a place of peace to be built by a man of peace. God says this further in the chapter, verse 12, "And when thy days be fulfilled, thou shalt sleep with thy fathers. I will set up thy seed after thee." This is Solomon. "He shall build a house for my name. I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever." So Solomon was to be the temple builder, and David spent the rest of his life gathering the materials. I might say in passing, he raised $3 billion for the temple project Solomon was to build. We'll say more on it next week. 12268, Dallas, Texas, 75225. Any amount above that is a donation, and Sha'alu Shalom Yerushalayim. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem.